So today we're going to talk about modeling shapes that aren't rectangles, or basic primitive shapes. And I think it's particularly relevant because you guys are starting to work on your assignment 201s with your chair, and frequently you start to build a chair and you decide you want a cushion or some kind of a pillow or something that goes with the chair. So it makes sense that now's about the time to start doing that. You're also starting to feel fairly comfortable with the basic primitives and understanding, like last class, to be able to build the window on your own, I think was good. And so today we're going to start working through making some cushions. I'm going to show you a couple different strategies for how you do it. We'll spend a lot of time with a command called the network surface or the curved network. Rhino uses those two interchangeably to create some complex surface geometry. We'll keep working as we go forward with more and more complex surfaces, but for right now, this is kind of the gateway into non-orthogonal, strict, rectangles, so to speak. So I went ahead and I opened up a Rhino file here that I'm going to start to build my cushions in. And I'll start first with, and you always, whenever you're doing cloth objects or organic shapes, you kind of have to have an idea of what it is that you're creating in the first place. You could, of course, create some kind of a blob, but then it's just a blob. So if you think about it in terms of, I want to make a couch cushion, and you go home and you look at your couch cushion and you look at what it looks like, that's going to help you a lot in trying to make a realistic couch cushion, if that makes sense. If you're trying to make a throw pillow, going home and looking at your throw pillows will make a difference. If you're trying to make the sheets on your bed, going home and looking at what the sheets look like will help. I think all too often people who try to model something that's an organic shape just go for it without actually observing what happens in real life. And so spending a little bit of time observing what real life looks like can make a big difference when we go to try to make it a little bit later on. So I'm going to start with a couch cushion. And certainly, I could start with the basic primitive of a square or a cube or whatever, and I could draw it, and I could start to try to modify the edges. I could do a fillet on the edges. I could fillet the surface to kind of create rounded edges, but it's never really going to look like a couch cushion. It's going to look like a box that has rounded edges because it's just too straight. So instead of doing that, I'm going to go ahead and start by just drawing a rectangle. So I'll use the rectangle corner-to-corner tool. I'm going to start at point 0, 0, and I'm going to say that this couch cushion is, I don't know, let's say it's 2 feet by 18 inches. So I said at 2 feet, comma 18 inches, and there's kind of the rough size of my cushion. I'm going to take this box, and I'm going to type explode, or I could go up to the edit menu and explode it right there, so that it is actually 4 individual line segments. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to kind of soften the edges of this curve a little bit. And I want to make it not so that all of these sides aren't perfectly straight. And so to do that, I'm going to actually control the line, or the curve, with its control points. And to see those points, I can type the command points on, or I could come over here and click this button for points on and points off. And when I do that with the line selected, you see that I can see 2 points that I could then manipulate. Now, that's not a lot to create a really curving line. So I would like a few more points on that curve. So I can take this. I'm hitting escape twice so that those points go away. I could take this curve, and I could use the rebuild command. It's under curve and then rebuild, I think. Maybe it's under edit. Yeah, it's under edit, rebuild. Sorry, I just typed rebuild. And with this little rebuild command in the dialog box here, when it says point count and then it gives me a number in parentheses, that is the current number of points that it has. So I already showed you this line. It had 2 points. It had 1 point on either end, so it had 2 points total. The degree of the curvature was 1 because it's a straight line. So I could say, you know what, I'd rather have 3 points. And I'd like my curvature will go up to 3. 3 means it can curve in all 3 directions. Truthfully, it's flat, so we only really need 2. And I could go ahead and say OK, and nothing changes. That's OK. However, if I click on the points on, or if I type points on, you could see that I've gained segments. So I now have 3 line segments, and I have 4 points. I could rebuild again, for example. And I could say, you know what, I want 5. I could say, OK. I could turn my points on, and there we go. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I could take it a step further, and I could rebuild by maybe 7. And when I turn the points on, we can now see that I have even more points. So I'm going to rebuild each of these curves. Same thing here. And they're all going to be by 7 and 3. And I'll say OK. Then I'll take all of my curves, and I'm going to turn the edit points on for all of them. So you can see that I now have all of these little edit points that have been turned on. Now it's time to make these curves not so straight. And the best thing to do when you're working with these is to stop trying to do precise measurements. Don't type anything in. We're just kind of dragging and moving. And this is another good opportunity for those of you that like the gumball to actually use the gumball. Some people prefer to work in the top view so they can look straight down on the objects. But what we're going to do is we're going to pull in the side here a bit. You could pull it all the way in until it's arcing, about there. I can pull this side in. It's about like that. And it depends on how casual the cushion's going to be, how sharp the corners are going to be. If you wanted it sharper than what I'm drawing, you could rebuild the curves and have even more curve segments. The hope is that these make a relatively smooth transition. I should point out that, I'll do this last one, I'm not clicking on a single, there's 2 points at the corner. And so I'm actually selecting both endpoints, and I'm moving both of those endpoints over. And I'm just clicking and dragging to move those endpoints. Now I need to soften up the edges here. They're still perfectly straight. Maybe I'll pull this curve out just a little bit. Maybe I'll pull this curve in just a little bit. I can also adjust these other curves if I want to. The key here is that in real life, this probably wouldn't be perfectly symmetrical. So by softening the edges and working my way around and making this so that it's not a perfect, it's not having perfect symmetry, I'm going to have a little bit more realistic results. And again, this is an example where looking at something in real life can help you determine how to make this particular shape. So now that I've created that, we can look at it again in the perspective view. That softened it up a little bit. I could also choose to move a few of these points up or down in the vertical direction. And that can make a difference on the cushion as well. I'm not overly worried about the bottom of this cushion because in all likelihood this is going to sit on something and it can be fairly flat. However, the top is going to matter. I'm going to want to control that a little bit more. So I'm not going to worry about the bottom for right now, but I'm going to worry about the top. So I've now softened up the edges on these 4 curves. I'm going to take these, I'm going to copy them, so I'll go to my transform, copy. Doesn't really matter where my base point is. Let me turn on my object snap here. And I want to, before I do the copy, I want to choose that it's going to be vertical. And we're going to go up, I don't know, by 4 inches, 4 or 6 inches, whatever the thickness of the cushion is that you want. There it is at 4 inches. And I started by copying so that these that's a good place to begin. However, the top and the bottom of the cushion are in all likelihood not going to be identical. So now I need to go back, turn my edit points on, and do a few more manipulations. And so again, it can be helpful to work in the top view. And so I might make a few adjustments on some of these curves. The corners are probably OK, but some of the rest of these could use a little bit of adjustment. OK, so let's say I'm happy with that. The other thing is on the top, this is where I'm going to start to control the heights just a little bit. So I'm going to pick a few points, and I'm going to move those points, and I'm actually going to type move. I would go up to transform move. I'm going to move them vertically just a little bit. I'll take a few of the other points. Oops, sorry about that. I hit escape one too many times. Turn my points back on. I'm holding down Shift as I select these points. I'm going to move them vertical. We'll maybe go down just a little bit. Subtlety is important here. We don't want to move too much, but you can see that I'm already just adjusting that curve a little bit. Maybe this front corner needs to go down just a little bit. Like that. So it has a little bit of an undulation to it. That's good. So at this point, I have 4 curves that are defining what I ultimately want to have as a surface. And thus far, the only command that would do something kind of like what we're doing would be the patch command. But I can tell you right now the patch command wouldn't work particularly well on this style object. So we're going to introduce a new command that you haven't used before, and it's called a network surface or a curve network. And I use those interchangeably because Rhino calls them interchangeably. I wish Rhino was consistent and just called it a curve network the whole time, but it doesn't. The curve network is accessed by going to the surface menu here, and it's right there under curve network. If, however, you want to type in the command, it's network surface. So network srf. That's where I'm telling you it doesn't agree with itself. So it's annoying. So I'll keep using the terms interchangeably. What a curve network is looking for, fundamentally, is 4 or more lines that are going fundamentally in one direction and fundamentally in the opposite direction. So essentially, in an ideal world, it's looking for something like this to make a surface in. So it's got 2 lines, 1 and 2, that are going in this direction. In this case, it would be the x direction. And it has 2 lines in the y direction. It would be OK to have a 3rd line that went in that direction, and even a line that went in this direction, because I would end up having 1, 2, 3 lines in this direction, and I would have 3 lines in that direction. It doesn't matter if this is not on axis. So I could take this and I could go like this. It can still make a curved network out of it. It's just generally going in one direction, generally going in the other direction. It would also still be acceptable to have a line that did that went across this, because it's still generally going in the same direction as these lines. Where it gets unhappy is if you have this condition, where it's not completely enclosed, you have an open-ended thing, or if you have a line where these 2 are joined, and it can't determine which direction this line is. In some cases, you can do these L's, but you have to be a little bit more careful when you do it. So let me show you some examples so that this starts to make sense. Hold on a second. There we go. So in this case, I have 4 curves. I have 1 and 2 that are roughly going in the x direction, and I have 3 and 4 that are roughly going in the y direction. If I use a network surface or a curve network, I'll go to Surface and then Curve Network. It's going to ask me to select the curves in the network. I'll say 1, 2, 3, and 4. Doesn't matter which order you pick them in. And I'll go ahead and hit Enter. It will then bring up the surface from Curve Network, and it'll give me tolerances, and it'll give me the edge matching. Well, all of the defaults here are just fine. The computers are powerful enough to handle these values. In the 5 years ago, the computers weren't, and this would have a tendency to crash when you tried to create it. So it's a lot easier now. You can basically keep the default options. When this initiates, it gives us some letter values, some temporary labels that identify the sides of my shape. So I have A, B, C, and D. This is what we're looking for. If it throws an error that says, unable to sort curves, would you like to manually sort them, something went wrong. So we're trying to not have it. Most likely, the curves don't actually match up. So when I say OK here, what the curve network is going to do is it's going to interpret a surface for me that lines up on all the outsides of my curves but gives me a little bit of an undulation. And you can see that that has a little bit of an undulation to it already. So already this shape is more natural than just a box, or just manipulating a box. We're starting to derive a shape from these curves. So that's fine, but maybe we want a little bit finer control. So I'm going to add another curve. I'm going to go in here to a polyline, and I'm going to snap to the middle of this line, and I'll go straight across and snap to the middle of that line, right there. Now remember, I've manipulated this a bit, so it might not be a straight line anymore. It might be up on a slope. That's OK. I'm then going to rebuild this curve, just like we did the outside curves, and we'll rebuild by 7. That's fine. And then I'll show the curves. So let's say that this seat is a little bit worn, and we've had a lot of people sitting in it. Well, chances are the back part of the seat would have a little bit of a depression where the stuffing's been smushed down a bit. So I'll take these 2 points, there and there. I'll move them, V for vertical, and we'll drop them down a little bit, maybe like that. Maybe the stuffing's a little bit overstuffed here because the stuffing has to go somewhere. So maybe we'll push these up just a little bit. Move, V for vertical, and we'll push those up just a bit. A little too much. Maybe like that. Now I have this curve, and this curve that are all going roughly in that direction. And I have these 2 curves here and here that are roughly going in the opposite direction. I can still create a curve network out of this. So I'll go up to surface and then curve network. It still recognizes it. And when I say OK, you can see that it's following all 3 of the curves. It's giving me that depression for where the person sat. Now maybe the person isn't 2 feet wide, so this depression is a little bit wide. So I could add another, let me delete this. I could add another line. I could say I want to go from this midpoint. Actually, I'm going to turn on the nearest snap so that I don't have to go from the midpoint. I'm just going to come over here about even with where the depression would be. I'll go to there, and I'm going to snap to the middle line. So again, I'm using near here, and then I'll continue on and snap to that line there. So there's a few important things to keep in mind. So I took this line, and I snapped to this line, I snapped to my middle, and I snapped to there. If I drew this straight across instead, and I said there and there, oops, sorry, and I tried to do a curve network, we've got a problem, because these 2 curves go across each other but don't intersect. So when I go to do a curve network of these, it's going to have issues, or the end result isn't going to turn out the way I want it, because it's going to be confused with which curve I'm using. I'm surprised it didn't throw an error on that. It should have thrown an error. So let me go back, new polyline, and I'm going to snap to the middle here, and I'm going to snap back up to this point. And then I'm going to rebuild this. And again, I'll rebuild by 7. I'll turn my points on, and I'm going to manipulate these points a little bit more. So I'll take this point and move it down. And maybe I'll move this point and move it up. Maybe I'll take this point and move it down. Take this point and move it up. That. And so I've managed to define what that top surface should look like. Now I can take those curves. That. I can go back up to my surface curve network. I can say OK, and I can build that shape such that it has the depression for where somebody's been sitting. So you see I'm breaking this down and trying to think through it. Now, what about the sides? Well, I have 2 curves already. I have this curve and I have this curve that are already there. I need a couple more curves to start to define this. So I could use a straight line that goes from here to there, and I could use a straight line that goes from there to there. So with these 4 curves, I can create another curve network. But I want a little bit more control. So let's again go to the middle and the middle. And I'm going to take this, this, and this, and I'll rebuild those. So I'll go to Edit and then Rebuild. I'm not going to do it by 7. It's too many points. I'm going to do it by 3. I'll turn my points on. And I need to do a few manipulations here. So in this case, it's helpful to work in 2 views at once. If I just tried to move these, it's going to be hard to kind of see how they're moving. So frequently, I like to select them in this perspective view and then move them in the top view. So I can say Move, and we can pull those over. The idea here is that I'm just trying to go out at about a 90-degree angle to the surface. So it sticks out just a little bit there on the corner. This one here in the middle is going to come out a lot more because that stuffing from the butt depression has to go somewhere, so we're going to push out the back. So I'll go to Move, and we'll pull this one out a little bit more. We'll come back to this one, and we'll move that one a little bit. Sorry. I needed just those 2 points, and we'll move those 2 points out just a little bit. I need to do the same thing on the front. So I'll go to here, front. Same thing over here. I'm going to rebuild these 2. I'm going to turn my points on. And I should point out the slight differences between the different point editors. I'll point that out in a second. We'll pull this one out just a bit. And we'll pull this one out just a bit too. So now if we start to look at it, I've created the top surface. It's time to create these side surfaces. I'll start with the back one. I've got 1, 2, and 3 that are going roughly in the z direction. I have this and this that are roughly going in the y direction, or the x direction. I can do a curve network from those. So I'll go up to Curve, and then Curve Network, Surface Curve Network. I'll say OK, and that builds that part of the cushion. Same thing. I didn't do the middle curve here. You can, of course, do it. There they are. Curve Network, and there's that side. Curve network there. And this is going to be my last piece there. I still have the bottom to do. I never built that, so we look at it from underneath. Oops. Remember, I need the curves, not the surfaces. So we'll say there, and there, and there, and there. Curve network. If you're typing it in, it's network surface. And now if we step back and have a look at this, I was able to create a fairly natural looking cushion. Much better than if I started with a rectangle and tried to make the sides or manipulate the sides. Now in my case, maybe this is a little bit too casual as a couch cushion. Maybe you want it to be a little bit straighter. You want your seams to be straighter. That's OK. You're the designer. You can figure out what feels right in terms of creating this style of cushion. So we've got a few other kind of things to deal with relating to this. And that is, first off, materials and texture mapping. And then we'll also go through how to apply a slightly different, to do a different type of organic shape, a different kind of pillow. So when I start thinking about materials, I need to load in a material to begin with. And so I would go into my V-Ray material editor, or I can load my V-Ray tools. I'll right-click on C Materials. I'm going to say Load Material. And for argument's sake, for what I'm doing today, I'm going to load in a kind of obnoxious material, but you can pick one of the ones that's not quite so bad. I'm going to go into my Resources folder, into V-Ray. And in here, I'm going to go into the Fabric category. And I have a bunch of different fabrics. There's some rather benign fabrics. There's leather and whatever, in which case the texture mapping isn't as important. Some of these with the big flowers and the swirls, the texture mapping starts to become important. Let me go ahead and do the blue flower for right now. There you go. You can see the texture with the blue hibiscus flower on it. I need to put that on a layer. I haven't done any organization just yet, so let me go into my layers. Let me change my default layer to be called couch, for example. I'll get rid of the rest of these layers. We'll create new ones when I create new cushions. And so this cushion needs to have this material applied to it. So I'll right-click and say Apply Material to Layer. And we'll put it on the couch. There it is. So now that I have the material applied, I'm going to switch over into my rendered mode so that I can see what this looks like from a preview standpoint. So it's not awful, but it's not the best yet either. So I'm going to do a couple things. One, I'm going to change the texture mapping on all these surfaces to start, and I'm going to do a box map to start. So let me select all the surfaces. I'm just holding down Shift as I select. The alternative solution would be to select, to type SEL SRF to select all the surfaces. And now that I have them selected, I'm going to go back into my properties. And we've done this before. We're going to go over, not to material, but all the way to texture mapping. And this, even though it's got soft corners, is kind of a box. So let's start with a box mapping. We'll do a bounding box. We'll do world. We do want it capped. And there it is. Now remember over here, we had a lot of luck with x equals y equals z. So I'll choose x equals y equals z to try to get the pattern to even out for us. All right. Seems reasonable. Now that I have that set up, I can also adjust the repeat. So if I wanted the flowers to be a lot smaller, for example, I could repeat by like 10 and I get little baby flowers. If I wanted them to be big, I could keep them at some interval. So in this case, I was able to create this. Now, there's a natural seam in the fabric that's happening right along that edge. And the way that I did the mapping, the texture of this roughly connects to the texture of that. And so that may or may not be your intent. The sides here, again, don't connect because they're disjunct. So depending on your fabric, you may need to get in and kind of fine-tune what they're looking at or what they look like. The other option would be to hide these seams with a little bit of piping. Now let me point out something that happened here. So the seam that I have created in my two surfaces occurs right there on that line. But the box map seam occurs over here because that's where the actual box lies. So I've got a little bit of a problem there. If I was really concerned about that, I could change all of these to be individually surface mapped so that each one had its own texture mapping to it so that I didn't have that little line there. I'm not overly worried about it. I think it's a reasonable approximation of what I'm after today. On this side, the seam falls almost exactly at 45 degrees, so I'm OK with that one. OK, so now that I have the texture mapping applied roughly the way that I want it to, we can use this one as a block and bring it into another seam, which we're going to do in a second. But some people prefer to add a little bit of like piping that would go around the outside of the seam so that you're not seeing the seam between these two. We can do the same thing if we want. All I would need is a cross-sectional curve. Let me go right on this edge here. And let me do a diameter of 3/16 of an inch. There that is. I'm going to rotate that 3D. And sometimes it's useful to have your quadrant snap when you're working with circles here. Okay, I'm going to fold that up into space. Then I'm going to rotate it again around that point. But I'm going to do it from the top view so that I can see this a little bit better. And we're going to rotate that till it roughly gets to that 45-degree mark. I could also specify 45 to make sure it's exactly at 45. That is definitely an option. So that then represents the cross-sectional curve. I already have my rail to do a sweep. So let me go ahead and do that. So I'm going to sweep one. We'll go ahead and chain my edges. Sorry, I didn't explain chain edges. So because I created these as a curve network, these are all individual curves. They're not one continuous curve. So when I do the sweep one, I have the ability to choose chain edges on a rail, which just means take this curve first, then connect it to that curve there, then connect it to that curve there, and finally connect it to that curve there. Once I have them set, I'll hit Enter. Then cross-sectional curve was that little piping. Enter. Seam, that's fine for the seam. Enter. And OK. And now I've created a little piece of piping that goes around the outside. In all reality, that probably needs to be like a different material, or at least I need to texture map it differently because it's stretching kind of funny. I might create a material that was just this same material without the flowers. That would be one way of doing it. By the way, next class we'll spend all class talking about materials again and how to create new materials from scratch. So we'll go through that. But I also might just load a different material. Let me go into my V-Ray material editor. Let me load a different material. Get into the fabric. I'll do the woven fabric white. It's kind of a generic white. Let me apply that material to selection. And now that goes around the outside. I do need to apply it to each of the segments because it made separate segments. There, there, and there. And so I'll go back to my V-Ray material editor and apply material to selection. I could also do a separate layer and have all of them applied there. But essentially that gave me the little piping that goes around the outside of the cushion. This cushion is looking uglier and uglier, by the way, the further I go with it. But anyway, you guys get the idea. So I could do the exact same thing down at the bottom. I could take the same cross-sectional curve here. I could copy it. I could drop it down to the bottom place here. We could do a sweep one. I want to chain, sorry. Sweep one. Chain edges. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll hit Enter. It's going to ask for my cross-sectional curve. There it is. I'll hit Enter. I'll say OK. Those all need to have the different material. So let me go back to V-Ray Material Editor and apply this material to selection. And now you can see that it has that piping at the bottom. So remember, of course, I could change, once I have the texture mapping and everything sorted out, I can change to, so I can make this a leather cushion instead. You've got a lot of flexibility. You can use any of those materials. Now I want to make sure that this actually looks good and renders out well. So I'm going to go ahead and save this as it is. I'll go to File and then Save. And I'll put it on my flash drive in today's folder. And I'll save. And then on the course website, just like we used last class under today's exercise, I have a sample file that has an environment already installed for you. So we can go to exercise 209 here. Of course, I'm not logged in. Well, anyway, I already have it. It was from last class. Hold on a second. What? All right, let's try that one more time. Oh, looks like I didn't actually cross-link it. So go to last class's exercise, which was 208. And that has the sample file right here that you can download. The advantage here is that I've already done the work for you, so you don't have to do the work to set up the sun and the scene and whatever, and the rendering is going to end up looking a little bit better. So once this one's open, we'll drop it in as a block and do a test render and see how it looks. All right, there it is. I'll go to File, or excuse me, Edit, Blocks, Insert Block Instance. I'll go browse for that file that I just saved. There it is. Link as my style here. There it is. Let's zoom selected on it. Z followed by S for selected. And then we need to do a quick render and see what it looks like. So I'll switch over here and we'll do the render. And we'll take a look. And so there you go. Not too bad in terms of creating a non-orthogonal organic shape. So if I want to create something a little bit different, I can still use the curved network. Let's say that I wanted to create one of those throw pillows instead. Let me create a new document here because I created, oops, sorry, that's the test rendering file. I'm just going to open another Rhino. Hold on a second. By the way, you can have as many Rhino files open at once as you want. You just have to open Rhino separately each time that you do it. So if I went up to File, Open from within Rhino, it will close the file that I'm working on and open the new one. So here's another Rhino. I'm going to say, let's create a little throw pillow. So in this case, the geometry of the throw pillow is a little bit different. It doesn't have the same kind of a thickness as a seat cushion, so I need to build it a little bit differently. I'll start again with the rectangle. We'll start at 0, 0, as I did. And a throw pillow is usually a little bit smaller. Maybe it's at 14 inches by 14 inches, for example. And this would be a square throw pillow. So let's say that I have the throw pillow set up that way. I'm going to explode it, just as I did before. And I'm going to rebuild those 4 curves in the same way that I did before. Point count is probably going to be back to 7. And then I'll turn on my edit points. There are 2 different points editing options. There's the points on, and there's the edit points on. I will show you the difference in a second. So it doesn't matter for right now which one you pick, but I do want to soften up these corners just a bit. So let me go into my top view, and I'll drag those down. I'm not quite as worried about making them perfectly rounded. Those cushions tend to have a little bit of a point to them, the throw pillows. So having a little bit of a point is not a bad thing. Move that down just a little bit. Move that down just a little bit. I need to make a few adjustments, so maybe I'll pull these out just a little bit. I'll pull these out just a little bit. I'll pull these out just a little bit. And whenever you put these throw pillows on a couch, typically one side is always kind of kinked down in the center, right? That top is usually, they usually do that. So anyway, you can do that too. So we can kink that down a little bit in the center as part of the look of the throw pillow, should you want to. Okay, so now if I were to look at this setup, it's very similar to what I had before, where I have the 4 curves. But before, I took these and I made a copy and I brought them up to create the thickness of the pillow. Well, a throw pillow tends to meet at this edge, but then have a hump in the middle. So I need to figure out how to create the hump. And there's 2 different strategies for how I'm creating this hump. and how they come together. And I'll show you both, and I'm going to make a copy to show you the two different strategies. So you can see me do it twice in two different ways. So the first one that I'll do is I'm going to start with a polyline, and I'm going to go from one corner right there. I do have to turn on my object snap so I can snap to that end. And I'll come over to that point there. And I'll do the opposite. I'll go from that corner to that corner. And you say, well, wait a minute. These two are exactly not what the other. So these curves are going in that direction. This is going exactly opposite. So Rhino can't figure out which way that curve is. So we need to do one more thing, and that is to make two of these curves like that join together. So if I join those into one curve, this is roughly going in this direction, same as that, which will be the same as this. They're all roughly going in this direction. You can see that it's pretty rough. This one is distinctly opposite, in which case this will do a curve network for me. So I'll take these two x's, I'll rebuild them the same way I've been doing. We'll rebuild by 7. I'll turn my points on. And now it's time to start moving them. So this is the middle of this point needs to go up the furthest. So move vertical. And I don't know, maybe I'll do 5 inches to start. I'll take the next curves, these two, and those two. We'll move them up to maybe 3 inches. Oops. Vertical. 3 inches. Like that. And then the last curves here, just have to make this not look silly. So move vertical, and we'll get those to come into the edges. So you see I started to create the throw pillow that way. I still need some differentiation. They can't be perfect arcs. So I might take these two curves and I might edit them. So here comes the difference between these two different curve editing modes. So if I click this option here, you can see that there's a curve and then there's a dotted line with the curves. I will get this, where I have a dotted line that represents the outer tangents of the curves. And I can control it that way. The other option on these curves is to have points actually on the curve to control. So in that case, the point is right on the curve, and it doesn't have the little dotted tangent line. It's just a way of working, and it depends on what's more comfortable for you. I tend to prefer this way, though many times it doesn't matter which one you choose. This just seems a little bit easier because it's like, oh, it's that point, I can move that point, and my line's going to move too. So let me move that, and let's move that one vertically, just a little bit higher. Let's take this one, we'll move it vertically a little bit lower. Let's move this one a little bit. Maybe just a little bit. These two points these two curves probably intersect right at each other. If you're in doubt, you can always take the points, turn the edit points on, and move one to the other. So I know that point is on my curve. Turn on point snap here, and I can make sure that that's going to go right onto that curve. So there's no doubt that they're intersecting. And that's if you end up having some trouble. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and do my curve network. So again, I have this curve, and that curve that are all roughly going in this direction. And I have this curve that's going in the opposite direction. I'll go up to Surface, Curve Network. I get fewer. I just get A and C in this case. I'll go ahead and say OK. And it's going to build that half of the pillow. So in all reality, I need to build the other half of the pillow. So we could stick that down below. I could take these two, and I could mirror them. And it might be helpful to try to do this in space here. Like that. And then I could take the same set of curves there, 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 and there, and I could do a network surface from those and build the other half of this. In this context, they're coming to a little bit sharp of an edge there. It would probably be better if I rounded that edge over just a little bit as part of the realism of that cushion. But I do have the little bit of a depression up top. And this, again, takes time and practice to kind of see how it works. So I told you that there were multiple ways of creating this. I can do the same thing that we did before, only instead of doing the X, I could do it just going straight and manipulating it that way. It's a little bit harder to work with, which is why I do it this way, because I think this one's a little bit easier to work with. But let me show it to you this way nonetheless. So in this case, I would go, let me turn on my mids point. We'll go from there to there. And we'll go from there to there. Once again, I'll select those two and rebuild. 7 is fine. Actually, you know what? I'm going to rebuild by 10. Have a few more control points here. Perfect. I'm going to turn my points on. This time, I'm not turning on the regular points. I'm going to turn on this one, the edit points, so that I have points actually on my object. It gives me a little bit finer control. Then I need to manipulate these. So I'll take the first points out for each of these. And we'll move them. Actually, do it in the opposite order. Let me take the middle cluster here, move them vertically by 5. Oh, let's go up by, I don't know, 1. Let me take the next group, and we'll go up by another 1.5. I'll take the next group, move, 1. OK, so I'm working my way in. Looks like I ended up with an extra point right here. Let's move that vertical. Oops. OK, these two curves definitely don't meet, so I'm going to spend a little bit of extra time turning those points on and making sure this point matches up with that point. I don't mind that that swoops around a little bit. It's OK. And in all reality, I should probably spend a little bit more time making this look better. But I'm trying to get you the idea of what it looks like and the strategy here. So once I have those set up the way that I want them, I can do the same thing. So I'll select the curves. I'll go up to Curve, and then Curve or Surface, Curve Network. And this time, I can build the pillow that way. And you can see that the results are slightly different if I'm building it this way versus building it that way. But I can still get to the same end result. So the more time you spend with the guiding curves, the easier it's going to be to actually create a realistic looking pillow. This is not the most realistic looking pillow in the world. In all reality, that peak point needs to go back down a little bit more. Okay? So I'm just trying to show you the strategies for how you create these different pieces. So that's an example. If I went to texture map that piece, this one probably doesn't need a box map. It probably just needs your standard surface mapping. So I'll go up to V-Ray, and then go to Material Options. And let's go ahead and load a material. We'll go to V-Ray, V-Ray Materials, Fabric. I'm going to do the gray stripes. I don't even remember what that one looks like, but we'll throw that one in there anyway. And typically, I would do it on a layer and get organized, but I'm just trying to show you what it looks like. So let me right-click and say Apply Material to Selection. And then we'll switch over into rendered mode so we can take a look at it. Ah, yeah, so that one has some transparency to it, apparently. Though sometimes you might need to actually render it out to see. Yeah, it's just for some reason it's showing transparency when it's not actually transparent. It's just the render preview. So there's my stripes. And in that case, the texture mapping turned out pretty good without me having to do too much. I can make edits to it. I could go back into my texture mapping. In this case, I think a surface mapping is pretty good. You could also use a planar mapping, but I think the surface mapping is probably best. And that's what's applied by default. There's my surface map. I might increase the intensity here, or the number of repetitions, so that my stripes get a little bit smaller. Remember, once you have it set up the way you want it, you can always match the mapping. So this object here, I want to match to the top. And now those are matching up pretty well. And that's giving me this style of cushion, or throw pillow in that example. So I could do a rotate 3D on it to get it to stand up. Maybe it needs to lean slightly because it is a pillow after all. And once I have this set up, then I can save this one, and I can use it to bring in to that other scene. So let me go to File and then Save As, or File Save. And let me put it in today's folder. I'm not overly worried about this other geometry because it can go away later. Let me go back to that final scene. This one, nope, sorry. This one here. We'll bring in that throw pillow. I'll go to File and then Place, or sorry. I did InDesign this morning, so I'm still in File Place. Sorry. It's Edit Blocks, Insert Block Instance. I'm going to go find that throw pillow. There it is. We'll go ahead and say OK. I want to have it as a linked reference. Say OK. And there's my throw pillow there. Like that. Maybe I need to move it vertically so that it's sitting up on top of this couch a little bit. Up a little bit higher. It might need to have a little bit of rotation put on it. Yeah, probably right about there. So I'm adjusting it so that it would be sitting there, assuming that there would be a back on this. This might take a little bit further rotation too. Goes back a little bit. Yeah, maybe something like that, as if it were sitting and there was a back to it. I haven't modeled the back, but you get the idea. And then once that's set up, I could go ahead and do a rendering of this scenario. I'm not condoning my fabric choices. Just trying to show you the example. Okay? So I'm going to let that one render out, and we'll come back and visit that again. Sometimes you want to create, and I know I'm kind of going on here, but when we're creating these kinds of things, I'm trying to show you a bunch of different examples. There isn't a right and a wrong to doing these things. It's just practice. So let's say that I wanted to create like some drapes or a curtain, something like that. I'll show you how to do that next. So I'm going to do a large object inches for this one. All right. And I need to start by kind of creating what I want to create. So let me do a polyline here. I'll start at 0, 0. I'm going to go 4 feet out this direction. So I'll go 4 feet out that direction, and I've now created this line. Now I need to rebuild this again, the way I've been doing, but my point count needs to be a lot higher, so maybe 20. We can preview it to kind of see. I'll go ahead and say OK. Turn on my points. There they all are. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select every other point. So we'll start with this point, and I'll select these versions right there. And we'll get to these endpoints in just a second. And I'm going to move those points back in this direction. So it should end up looking a little bit curtain-like already, right, in terms of profile. These end curves, I told you we had to deal with a little bit separately, and that's because these have to end up coming all the way back. So let me move them. And this might be easier to see it in the top view as we move them back. Come back to right about there so that they're even. They may take a little bit of extra manipulation to get the ends to look right. Yeah, that's reasonable. So now that I have that curve, let me hit escape twice. I'm going to go ahead and take this and I'm going to copy it. And I'm going to copy it vertically. And so let's say that we wanted this drape to be 8 feet tall. I'd go up by 8 feet and I get my second version of it. I could take these two like that, and I could do a loft or I could do a curved network of them. In a straight loft, there's not a lot of variety in what this is looking like. So yeah, they look like curtains, but they're pretty rigid. So let's start to give ourselves a little bit more control. Let me take another one of these and pull it up halfway. So I'm going to copy it vertically. We'll put it at 4 feet. There's the halfway point. And let's say that I wanted the bottom part of this. Well, I'll leave this out for just a second. Let me make a second copy. Perfect. Let's say I wanted the bottom of this to be blowing out. I could turn my points back on. I could take the middle section of these points, and we could start to move these out. And this is going to take a little bit more manipulation. You're getting the idea there. I could also take and connect, turn back on my object snap and my midpoint here. I could connect these points. So I could go from there to there. I could go from the end to the end. And I could go from the end to the end. This then gives me some control over what the billow would look like. So I could rebuild this. I'm going to do it just with 3 to keep it simple for right now. Let me show those points, and we'll move these 2 out just a bit. Like that. And then we could build this out of a curved network. So I'd go back up to surface and then curved network. Say OK. And now I'm starting to create this with a little bit of a flex in it. Do you guys see how this is working? If I wanted them to kind of swag to one side, I could take the same thing here. I'm going to do one in the middle here. There we go. And I could do a scale 1D on these. So let's take these 2, scale 1D. And I could say, instead of being that long, I want them to be a little bit shorter. Maybe like that. Maybe this lower one comes out just a little bit more. Maybe it needs to go more like that. Let me create a curve. I'm going to do this second one here, interpolate points, to go from there to there and up to there. And I'll do another curve. There, there, and there. That ends up being a straight line. This is looking an awful lot like a network surface now. So I can do the same thing where I take these pieces and I go to curve, surface, curve network, and I can build that in that context. Now I would probably need something to tie the curtain back that causes this to feel like it's being pulled. But you see how I'm using these same strategies to create this? The one last thing that I want to point out is, let's say that I needed a curtain rod. You always need a curtain rod too. We can use the same strategies that we've been doing to create a curtain rod through these. So I could start at 0, 0. And I said it was 4 feet long. So let's do 5 feet. There it is, right there. Let me move it vertically. Let's do 7. There we go. I'm trying to create where the rod would be. Sometimes you have to look at it in the top view to make sure that this is intersecting where it needs to be. So let me move it over to right about there. If I took that line and I installed a circle on the end of it, that was the diameter of my curtain rod. So let's do a diameter of, I don't know, what's a curtain rod? 1.5 inches. Something like that. I could take this and use the project command to throw circles all the way through this. So I could say project. I want to project that circle onto, we'll go all the way through both of them like that. Which gives me, see how it gives me all the little holes where the curtain rod would go? Can we use what? Sweep. Yeah, you could just sweep it. Sure, no problem. So there's all the little holes. Now it's just a matter of trimming them out. So I'd go back to here, go to trim. Of course, it's deciding to go really slow on me. But you get the idea of being able to trim out that little curtain rod that would be holding it. So the point here, the reason that I'm going through all of this, is to try to show you the ways that a curved network can actually create these kinds of shapes. And the more realistic these shapes are, the more they're going to match what's actually happening in real life. So if you were at home and you saw a curtain and you started to see what it looked like blowing in the wind, you could match that kind of general geometry. We don't have things like wind or gravity in Rhino to apply to an object. So it's a little bit more subjective in terms of you have to look and observe and then decide how what makes it look right. So what I'm asking you to do today is to create some of these objects. Try to do the pillows, try to do a curtain, see what happens. Pick the best of your objects. You're going to be posting that at the end of class today. It's important that you get very comfortable with the curved network and the ability to create these kinds of curves. The place where people get screwed up most often with a curved network is making sure that you have curves going in one direction and going in the other direction. And it's very clean that there is clearly one direction and the other. The other thing that happens is when curves don't meet. So you've got gaps in the outside curves, or you have two curves that go over the top of each other and don't actually touch. Those are the places where Rhino can get a little messed up. Okay? So I'll let you guys start working. I'll come around and help you when you need help. But have some fun with this. This is meant for you to be fun. If you want to create an object that's relevant toward your assignment 201, which is due a week from today, by all means, create a pillow for that chair. Do those kinds of things. They may be more valuable than just making something arbitrary. Okay? So don't be afraid to spend some time working on that today as well. That was also a very subtle reminder that the assignment's coming up to being due, right? So I know I give it to you with a lot of lead time, but it's coming. It's due next Wednesday the 3rd, which somehow magically it's October. Yep. Yeah, it's due before the start of class. So that's the way everything, when it's due on the 3rd, it's due before I start talking on that day. And that's so that you're not sitting and working on it while I'm talking. You're actually paying attention to what I'm talking to or about. Okay, sounds good. Hold on, let me